Dobrý den. Já vám předně moc děkuji, že jste dneska přišli. Rovnou vám povím, že toto je poslední Urban Talk z téhle sezóny. A já jsem hrozně rád, že jste nám byli celou dobu věrní a že doufám, že nám budete věrní tu další sezónu. Byla to série přednášek, která má ohromný úspěch a nás hrozně baví, že sem chtějí hosté za námi takhle jezdit, že se jim prostor líbí a že se od nich dozvíme nějaké nové věci. Moje jméno je Jiří Jaroš, budu dnešní večer trošku moderovat, i když předpokládám, že moderaci nebude potřebovat, protože prezentace, kterou máme dneska připravenou, je moc zajímavá. Vy určitě víte, že dnešním hostem je ateliér Interboro z New Yorku, a řečníkem je Tobias Armborst. Než mu předám slovo, chci zmínit to, že přednáška je o veřejném prostoru a vy víte, že tady výstava o veřejném prostoru teďka je. Bude tedy končit stejně jako kemp svoji sezónu teďka v neděli, takže máte poslední možnosti tady takhle vidět až do víkendu. Potom se kemp na červenec zavře, my si trošku odpočineme, nabereme nové síly. A na srpen to tady bude nějaké letní kino a pak od září se začneme s novou výstavou a zase budeme připravovat akce jak na běžícím páse, takže doufám, že se tady ukážete. So, now let me switch to English because our guest is from New York, as you know, but originally from Düsseldorf, as I hope he will introduce that. And so I will give you a word, Tobias. Welcome here in camp. You have your mic, so you're ready, and I'm really looking forward to see your presentation and hear something about public space in New York.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, whatever he said. Thank you, Jerry, for that introduction. It's really exciting to be here and to be here on the hottest day of the century. So even if you're here for the air conditioning, thank you for coming. I would like to talk tonight about the work of Interboro and our work on public space specifically. I would, I'm going to talk a little bit about our published work, some of our research work, and then I'm going to show you some examples of our planning and design work. So it's going to be about reading the city partially and then making the city. So two aspects that are important in our work, but as you'll hopefully see over the course of the presentation that they're actually in whatever we do, these two modes of dealing with the city are inextricably linked. And I think that is a good thing, and that's something that should be the case, specifically in a situation like in the United States right now, where there's on the one hand a very academic planning discourse on issues of city planning, and on the other hand, a rather uncritical urban design practice that's doing, developer-driven projects. So the connection between looking closely, reading what we find out there, taking lessons from it, and then planning and designing, that's really important to the work of Interboro, which I founded in the early 2000s with my two partners, Georgine Theodore and Daniel Dioker, you see here. We started the office in New York City where, as you can see here, we have a lot of relatives. So we're a big Interboro family there. We're specializing on architecture, urban design, and planning. What we do is, and what I'm going to show you tonight is a lot of urban public space work, public space interventions, public spaces, some of which you see here, planning work, larger scale, master planning for cities and neighborhoods and regions. And a big aspect, an important aspect of our work is tools, to develop tools, design tools, that make those planning processes more accessible, more democratic, design spaces, design objects that are about starting conversations around planning and helping generate conversations around them. That is something that has become really important to us, and I'll talk about that more in a little bit. First, though, about the reading aspect. So I wrote down here a little quote by Iris Marion Young, since I heard that this talk and as part of this exhibition and your ongoing program is focusing on public space. I looked up an old quote by Iris Marion Young, who in the article City Life and Difference wrote about public space as heterogeneous, plural, playful, a place where people witness and appreciate diverse cultural expressions that they do not share and sometimes not even fully understand. And that sort of understanding of public space is quite important to us, to think of public space as a space of difference, not as a space of unity, but a space of difference and a playful understanding and interaction of difference, different cultural expressions, different publics, and so on. Now, then, of course, for urbanists, the question is how can the built environment, the design of the built environment, support or increase that, or play a role at least in that kind of idea of the public sphere as one of playful interaction of difference. So that's something that's important to us, something we do in our work. However, even though that sounds a bit maybe academic and abstract for the beginning of a talk, a lot of our work of reading the city or pleasure reading the city is quite empirical. It's about looking closely at what people do with their city, how they transform the spaces they inhabit, sometimes radically transform the meaning of urban spaces, sometimes thereby transform the shape of urban spaces, and how that process of transformation, bottom-up transformation, can really be transformative in making a new kind of city, a new kind of urbanism. What do I mean by that? Let me show you an example. Actually, our very, very first, one of our early research projects, which was dealing with the city of Detroit. I don't know if you know much about the city of Detroit, but it is a city that has been losing population now for probably 4 decades. And by the mid-2000s, when we started working there, and we've been working there ever since, the kind of general discourse or presentation of Detroit as a city was one of complete abandonment and disinvestment. So there were a lot of at that time, a lot of beautiful photographs of ruins, like this one that you're seeing right here, images of a city that's turning back to nature, that is, has a certain beauty in its complete dereliction. Now, that was sort of a discourse that was really dominant, but at the same time, it was still a city that had about 800,000 residents, and we were sort of interested in what those residents were doing with that city, how they were living there, and how they were responding to that situation of a city that's, well, shrinking, that's losing population, and where they therefore also had kind of the remaining people, those that were the sort of the losers or that were invisible in this discourse of the city, how they were actually making do and transforming their city. Like this family here, for example. What they did here was what we then termed a blot. This is a spatial practice whereby homeowners that remained in the city expanded their properties by buying for very cheap or appropriating land adjacent to their homes. This one we call the courtyard blot. You see what happens here. Actually, you see it behind me. So that was the home originally, this typical Detroit bungalow on a typical Detroit parcel, what you see there in red. The family acquired the vacant land next to their house there and also added a little bit of architecture, like a porch there on the side, thereby reorienting this house. And finally, they actually took just another piece of vacant land next to their house, put a big fence around it, and turned this into a courtyard house, right? So that's a way in which these people just, made do and, responded to the shrinkage of their city by expanding what they own. Or this family here, over decades, created this large compound with a fence around it. Anyway, so interesting, right? There are these ways in which people change the architecture, change the ownership of the city, change what the size of parcels is, what the shape of parcels is, all that in this bottom-up way, and in practices that are primarily interested in increasing increasing their own use value of the land, but at a large scale, and this happened all over the place. Here are just some random examples of cadastral maps of the city. So these are blocks in the city. What's in red are those plots, right, where homeowners expanded their properties, like these guys, the Misiks. Look at those, you know, owning this entire block there. So the DNA, the structure of the city, the ownership of the city changes, radically changes, but based on not a large vision, but on the individual actions of these people who are working there, people that don't have a presence in these large narratives of the city of Detroit. So that's not really dealing with public space. You might say that is really about the owned land, but that is one of those aspects that we're really interested in. How does urban transformation happen through those small moves, those small spatial, we could say, everyday practices? Here an example from public space, right? These are two pictures that I just took last week in the South Bronx, where we're working on a neighborhood plan. And sort of what's happening here is that somebody is just selling fruit from a van and sort of put up this canopy over the sidewalk and using this metal chain fence there as a backdrop, right? So, which is, I mean, it doesn't look great, right? It's just, at first you say, well, what's going on here? But it's sort of interesting, right? In this tactical way, very simple moves, just parking the truck, putting up a canopy, the meaning of the space radically changes. Or rather, it has two meanings, right? There's still a sidewalk, the part of the urban infrastructure, but at the same time, there's a shop. So two spaces happening at the same time, even if temporarily. That's the kind of stuff where we take a lot of our lessons that we're fascinated with, or where we learn lessons for public space design, tactical public space design. This one, similar thing happening in now back in Detroit, in Banglatown, where we're also currently working on a neighborhood plan. And this is just something you see on the street there. So there's a preparation for a Bengali wedding going on. So there's this ritual gate set up. And we have this space here that is, sorry, what did I do? There it is. The space that was supposed to be the pointer, this space, which is really just a leftover space, right? That's a space that's defined by zoning. Every house needs this much setback from the side, and then there's a little bit leftover space. But here, for one afternoon during this wedding, this becomes the most sacred and meaningful space around, right? So there's small architectural intervention, small architectural piece here that radically changes the meaning of the space. So we find a lot of that sort of stuff out there. Sorry, what you see here on the right actually is another kind of small architectural intervention similar to this one, but this is a very different story, right? So what you've heard so far from me is a kind of lionization of tactical moves in the built environment, how people transform their environment by placing little built artifacts in there, and change the meaning of the environment, and how that is transformative and potentially empowering, right? People taking control of their city. Now, not every kind of tactical architecture is empowering. This is a different story. This is the tactical use of architecture to, what we could say, disempower and divide. What this is well, you'll see. So this is another built artifact in the city of Detroit, or rather on the border of the city of Detroit. If you look at this diagram here, you see the city boundary between the city of Detroit proper and its suburb of Grosse Pointe. If you can read that from back there, you see some of the indicators of race and economic status there. So it's radically different environments, economically, racially, different life chances, one could say, on the two sides of the border. And it's one of those really stark borders that are so that shape metropolitan areas in the United States, right? So you have a very, very poor, in this case, a very, very poor central city and a relatively wealthy suburb. So this is an invisible border, we could say. It becomes visible only on the drawing of the map. But recently, the border became more visible in the space of the city in that the suburb of Grosse Pointe started, well, fortifying this border, first with things like snow piles. So this is, the city started storing the excess snow on one of those cross streets, one of the streets that goes across the border here. It's, I mean, right now, the idea of a huge snow pile sounds rather attractive to me at this very moment, but it is in a place like Detroit that's super cold, where there's a lot of snow. It really becomes a border, right? You just can't cross the municipal boundary between Detroit and Grosse Pointe anymore because of this pile of snow. So that was the first move. And then more recently, this shed was built, again, right in the middle of one of the cross streets. It says there in the news flash, newly constructed barrier appears to separate Grosse Pointe Park and Detroit. So what is this barrier? What is this shed? It's actually, if you ask Grosse Pointe Park, this is a shed for a farmer's market. This is a farmer's market that is part of the idea of the city or the suburb, rather, to become more attractive to young, white-collar employees. So the street was pedestrianized. You see a new curb, so what was a street is now a pedestrian zone, and there is a farmer's market there. Happens to occur just on the street that connects Grosse Pointe to Detroit, right? So it's funny in multiple ways. One, I think it's interesting that here a tool of exclusion is something that, or two things that nobody could have anything against, right? Pedestrianization or Copenhagenization, as they call it there, right? So you say, oh, this is great, there's now a pedestrian zone and there's this farmer's market, but the way it's used or the context of where it is used is, well, turns it into really a tool of exclusion, of denying access or denying connection between city and suburb. So that's one thing. It also talks to the incredible, we could say, creativity that people come up with to exclude or to create borders without having to admit to it, right? It would be one thing to say we don't want, you know, poor black Detroiters in our city, and therefore we're closing the street off. It's another one to build a farmer's market here in the middle of the street. So that's one artifact from Detroit. Here's another one, a little bit older. This is the Burwood Wall. We see it actually there, all the way in the corner. So that's an historical artifact. It's no longer keeping people apart, but it was sort of a remnant of a time when, in this part of Detroit, a developer wanted to build a subdivision for white middle-class families, and was only able to get a mortgage, a federally insured mortgage, when there was some kind of division between this subdivision and an adjacent African-American neighborhood. So here the wall, the artifact, this political artifact, really is not in the first sense a barrier to separate, but it's the symbol of separation that becomes valuable. And in this case, putting up the border allowed the developer indeed to receive a federal insured mortgage and build the subdivision. Anyway, a historical artifact, a contemporary artifact, two built artifacts, two pieces of architecture, we could say, that are, you know, we could say political artifacts, right? The architecture talks to this purpose of, in this case, excluding as part of this suburban-urban divide or as a expression of a racist mortgage policy. Both entries from the Arsenal of Exclusion and Inclusion, a book that we published recently that is actually has a collection of such artifacts, but also policies, practices, and laws that exclude or include. So that we can really read those artifacts as kind of Rosetta Stones or so that show us some of the divisions in the American landscape. Anyway, this is the Arsenal. This is a mural that has all of the 163 tools in it that are in the book. We tried hard to edit it down to 101, but we weren't quite able, so there are 163. Here you see where they're hidden if you want to find them. That's the list of all the tools. Again, these are some of the authors. So it's a big group of authors, including us, and all the way over there, including us and many architectural historians, planners, urban historians. And what we don't in this, what I should say about the list, there's no division here between, I mean, if you look back, you have a whole Prague arsenal there, and it's great to see that we have some of those tools that are here in the exhibition or in the arsenal, some of those built artifacts. There's no division here between tools or what we call weapons that are indeed physical artifacts, but also policies and practices, actually. So what is in this is actually the first image of the book where you see two artifacts, one of exclusion, one of inclusion, and that's sort of paradigmatic of the book's content, right? Because we have here, this is not in Detroit, but this is down the street from our office in downtown Brooklyn, in the shop window of a real estate office. And so sort of an interesting combination of these two things that are and it's sort of paradigmatic of the tools that are in the arsenal, because they talk to the two main arenas of inclusion and exclusion that we're dealing with, namely public space, right? No loitering, that's giving us an instruction for what to do or what not to do in public space. And then fair housing, right? And the legally mandated, the federally mandated display of this sign in the window of a real estate office. So we're dealing with, say, federal policy here and with, well, kind of a questionable thing, right? There's no real legal standing for no loitering zones. There's not even really a definition for what loitering is, right? What do you do when you loiter, right? it's actually interesting to look at some municipal codes and see how they define loitering, and it is, you can really see how they struggle to say, you know, it's just standing around, but it's just only standing around when you're a certain type of person, or you look like you're about to do something bad, and so on. So we're dealing with the sort of gray area of social practice and with the law. We're dealing with physical artifacts, but sometimes the physical artifacts are signs. And we're dealing with these different arenas of public space on the one hand, housing on the other. Okay, so what's in what are some of the entries? Yes, the armrest on the bench. I think you have one here in the exhibition as well, right? So this is a typical, here it is, up there. There you see some examples in the drawing, an example from New York City, right? So public benches that have armrests, often armrests that are not really, you know, comfortable to put your arm on, but they're very effective in preventing people from sleeping there, right? So there's an object that already makes a statement about what you can do and what you should not do in public space, namely stretch out and sleep on a bench, right? So there's another artifact, another built artifact, in this case as a piece of furniture, right? And it's one that's particularly targeting those people that want to rest in public space, aka the homeless. And of course, there's a whole sub-arsenal in the arsenal of weapons that are dealing specifically with that target audience. Some of them are municipal rules, such as many cities that have camping ordinances, right? So that really are prescribing of what you can, where you can camp, right? So that you see here this community board meeting where you see this display of basically the homes of homeless people. Sidewalk management plans is another new euphemism for a municipal rule that deals with sitting down or not sitting down in the public sphere, right? So again, you see a lot of euphemisms in this arsenal of exclusion. But of course, also in the United States, in places that are very car-based, something like a residential parking permit can become a very powerful tool. Again, here we're dealing with the municipal rule, but it can become a very powerful way of keeping people away from certain neighborhoods. Another way of keeping people away from certain neighborhoods, or in this case from a shopping center in Maryland, where kids started skateboarding and the owner didn't like that and put in these speakers that were blasting classical music to keep those skaters away, right? Because skateboarders don't like to skate with Four Seasons playing in the background, right? So there's again a sort of you see the kind of creativity of the tools that people come up with if they want to keep somebody out, but they don't want to admit to it. But of course, and many of these tools go both ways, but of course there are also some inclusionary tools, there's a whole history, of course, of regulations, inclusionary zoning, which is powerful, but also new inventions such as aging improvement districts to make open up the city or parts of the city to people who can't walk that easily, and more creative tools like this map by a group called the LA Urban Rangers, who use the tool of a map to give the public access to beaches that are at least partially public, but that have been privatized or that have been through confusing signage, through fencing and so on, have become really inaccessible. So here, we could say, kind of educational tool of the map becomes a tool of, well, giving access to the places that are rightfully public, namely the beaches. All right, so let me show you a little bit after I showed you some of our work reading the city. Let me show you some examples, perhaps, of how some of the lessons of the book might play out in practice, in our work. I mentioned that we're working at different scales in the design of public spaces, larger neighborhood and regional plans, and then particular tools to not only generate those plans or set up planning processes, but making those planning processes more accessible, more integrated, and more participative. So let me where is it here? Okay, let me start showing you some of our work in public space. So this is actually one of our first public space projects, Land Space in New York City. So this was a temporary public space for a couple of years, built on a site that was eventually going to be redeveloped. In the meantime, a nonprofit art organization wanted to use it as an sculpture park plus a tree nursery. So when we started working on this project, there was this kind of situation of two clients, or client and a landowner. The landowner who owned this land actually insisted on this park being fenced in. So for insurance reasons, right, there's a public space that is actually privately owned. There needs to be a fence around it. Seemed weird to us, seemed weird to our client to have a public sculpture park being fenced in, and so we fought this fence for a long time. But eventually, since there was no budgeting, decided to design a really nice, cool fence. And this cool fence is one that actually isn't as much as a border as it is a place of activity. So it's a fence that turns so people can move around, like this gentleman back there in the corner. We added windows, like these Corbusian band windows. We added benches in order to turn this into a kind of conversational space. You see it here. You can either have sort of a larger conversation, or you can move a little bit more closely, right? So to take a piece of street furniture, in this case, one that is made to close off and turn it into something that is, again, perhaps a little more playful. And it was important to us here to make this thing a little bit weird, right? So it's ambiguous enough, you can't really decide, is this a bench, is this a sculpture, is this a fence, is this a piece of art? So it's ambiguous enough to allow for transformations of that nature, transformation. We imagined all ways and all sorts of ways in which this thing can be transformed. We didn't expect it to become at Occupy Wall Street for this to become a barrier, right? So good, this was transformed in ways that we predicted and in ways that we did not predict, right? But there's I think a lesson here for the design of public furniture as being multi-layered, gives the possibility to apply multiple meanings and multiple uses. So we're doing that with other things like these sort of small ad block pieces that allow people to basically make parking spaces, or parks in little parking spaces, right? And it's flexible enough, and it uses some of the vocabulary of street furniture, like the barriers you have here, uses some of that vocabulary to be a little bit under the radar. Here, that same piece is used by the Department of Health for temporary installations in the street, right? So public spaces, but designed as a small object that you can use and transform. Here, I'm going to flip through this. This was a project we did for Venice, where we were designing a space for conversation at the American Pavilion, space for conversation, place to hang out, and a space to play. Basically developing what in the United States in the 1970s people called a conversation pit, right? But we did it on a really low budget, borrowing some of the street infrastructure that Venice uses during high water, and in exchange then gave these seating elements back to the city. So that's one way in which we operate with sort of small budget projects like that, to set up these kind of networks, moments of exchange, of gift exchange, or exchange of material. Okay, more recently we did a public space for Harvard that is a space that, a shade roof that allows for all sorts of uses to happen below the shade roof, but on top of a piece of infrastructure. So here the challenge was perhaps one of public space as much as of engineering, namely to put something that is a big sail on a piece of infrastructure where there's no space for big foundations. That's something we did a little bit earlier in a project that I just want to quickly show you as well here. When we put a shade structure on top of a museum that you can normally puncture to attach anything to. So this was a shade structure that had to be held in place by weight, and this is covering the courtyard of the Museum of Modern Art's PS1, which is a museum in Queens. Here you see it that during the summer season is used for weekly events, really large music performances, and with lots of people in this little courtyard, which you see over there, right? The shape of the courtyard, and it is it's pretty hot there, so the museum always commissions architects to create a kind of shade structure and generally like a pavilion, an environment for this thing. So temporary architecture, and one that, the question of temporary architecture, of course, is always when you design something and the client pays for it, and what you do with all these, hopefully beautiful things that you design after the temporary event is over. So that was something we were thinking about in this case, and we found the answer really not inside the museum, but outside of these walls. You see those concrete walls here, and this is an outside view. There you see the wall of the museum back there. What you see in the foreground is a little shade structure that was built by a taxi cab company. So there's a bunch of taxi drivers who park across the street from the museum, change shifts and repair their cars, and while they do that, or while their cars are being repaired, they can rest here, take a break, hang out. In the summer, there's a kind of shade over here. There's some plants and chairs. And so when we saw this, again, sort of something that you just observe, like this weird little space, but when we saw this, we thought it was interesting because the programmatic requirements of this thing here, of this public space, are pretty much the same exact programmatic requirements that the museum had. Right? A place to sit, a place to hang out, some shade, some plants. And so we thought it would be a good idea to create a kind of match between the inside and the outside, between the space of the museum and the neighborhood around it. And so we asked people like the cab drivers, but also dozens of other neighbors, hundreds of other neighbors, if there was anything they needed, right, for their public space, that we could make use for the summer in the museum and then hand to them in the fall when the shows were done, when the temporary exhibition was over. So setting up a kind of process, a continuity here. So we asked the cab drivers, we asked, again, many people in the neighborhood, in this sort of working class and manufacturing neighborhoods, if there was anything they needed that we could make for them. Kids here, this guy. And so these are the things that people asked for and that we made. So this is the inventory of all the designed objects, all the street furniture, a lot of planters, a lot of benches, climbing walls, a lifeguard chair, lots of trees. So you see some of the objects that came out of this process. And here you see where all of those things went, right? So this is the borough of Queens, which is one of New York City's 5 boroughs. And you see this project, even though it's small, it's just really dealing with this small public space, or then public space within the museum, actually spread throughout the entire borough, because our clients, 50 different clients instead of one museum, were all over the borough. Here you see some of those spaces where those things went. So everyday spaces, little front yards, parking lots, and so on. So here, this guy, if you want to look all the way over here, this is one of the Teamsters, which is sort of like a trucking union. They have their headquarters across the street from the museum, and they wanted some trees, some outdoor furniture. So we got the trees, stored them in the museum. It was a very nice little temporary forest over there, and then here you see the tree planted in the Teamsters headquarters, parking lot in the fall. While in the museum, each tree had a little label that said who owns this thing, right? So it's about creating those connections. Or these guys, the Long Island City School of Ballet needed new mirrors for their ballet studio. We got those mirrors, installed them in the museum in this sort of pseudo post-minimalist installation. And then in the fall, these mirrors were installed. However, while they were in the courtyard of the museum, they were the setting for lots of programming. So the ballet school did quite a bit of programming in that space. So they did dance there as a kind of gift exchange, right? So you get the mirrors in exchange. We give you these performances, right? And it's an interesting way in which the artifact, the built artifact, the mirror here, starts playing a role beyond just sitting there and being architecture, namely as this moment of exchange and conversation. By the way, also very popular selfie spot, right? The space filled with mirrors. And again, of course, the cab drivers who asked for lots of stuff, including ping pong tables, but also seating elements. And here you see them receiving those elements, including the ping pong table, in one of the cab parking spaces. Okay, why is that interesting, and why I'm showing this to you in a talk about public space? Because what this did for this, again, duration of 3 months in the courtyard of an institution that I was reminded of when we were walking around here, and a space that is public but that is separated from the rest of the city by a wall as the area of an institution, in this case an art institution. But this turned into a, we could say, deliberate public space, because it was the shared setting of 3 very specific publics, right? So it's not about public space, just space for everybody, but there's specific, very different publics that are sharing this space and are potentially interacting. So there's these party people, there's the art crowd, right, that can read this installation in one way, but then also there's a group of new visitors, let's say, people who come here from the neighborhood, have never been in the museum, to engage with the stuff that they basically own, right? So she owns that sandbox, and she comes and visits and hangs out there and plays in that sandbox. We also did a bunch of then programming with our partner institutions, so really making visible the coexistence of these different groups, different publics that are latently present in the neighborhood, but here they're kind of pushed together in this almost social condenser of the museum courtyard and become visible in this way, right? So that is one of our attempts at creating sort of the space of difference that Iris Marion Young talks about, that is playful in a way, right? It's a kind of playful interaction made possible through the built artifact, or we could say the architecture, right? In this case, the architecture of the furniture, but it's not about the product as it is, but it's about this object as the token of this interaction. Okay, what we're doing quickly, maybe I lost a little bit. I just think I should hurry up a little bit here. Let me just very quickly show you some ways in which this plays out in a larger planning work. Again, this is a work we're doing now for Detroit, for the Campo Bangalatown neighborhood. You see here, this is a map of vacant property. And you see here that also occupation, right? So green is occupied. You see kind of division within the city, in the neighborhood. So this is the neighborhood. You see there are certain areas that are really occupied and with a lot of buildings, and then you see some areas like this one, East Davidson Village, that are really very vacant, right? There are few buildings left, and lots of those are no longer occupied. So these divisions have partially to do with the history of the grid, right? So with urban morphology, there's a whole history of, again, we're in Detroit, so there's racist planning policies, there's the development of the grid that just has these incredibly long blocks here that have very few cross streets. And so there, our proposal, our work is really about increasing access in a very direct way, right? Of reusing this moment that the city, a lot of the city is vacant, and the city actually owns a lot of property, right? Because a lot of this vacant property reverted to the city and is therefore city owned. So the fact that the city owns a lot of property and gives actually the opportunity for large urban design moves, urban plan changing, adjusting the urban grid that wouldn't be possible under normal circumstances. So a lot of this work, again, is dealing with vacancy, the question what to do with land, what you see here in green, parcels that are city-owned. We propose a series of programs, setting aside some of the land for larger infrastructure measures, reserving some of the land for neighbors, right? People who are still living here and who might already have or might in the future expand their property along the lines of what you saw at the very beginning. But then there are some parcels left, what you see in orange, and for those we propose what we call a bundling program where multiple parcels are put together and then sold off to people or organizations who can use these larger lots like this. What you see here is, I mean, this is one of these organizations that is working in the neighborhood that can make use of such a program. So this is an organization or a collective of Bengali women who garden in their backyards and sell the produce. And this is their block. They're running out of space. And so they can acquire one of these larger lots and the plan is to have a larger farming operation and to also create an industrial kitchen. So these are then ways in which we as urban designers, by say changing the size and shape of parcels, can support such, say bottom-up initiatives or businesses like those guys. Okay, but one aspect that I wanted to quickly show you is, again, this is that neighborhood that has a lot of this vacancy, and a lot of this land is city-owned, but also a lot of this land is stewarded by people who are still living there. So there are a bunch of people left in the neighborhood, and they have their parcels. Some have expanded their parcels, but then they also take care of a lot of the city-owned land, right? They mow the lawn, or they use it for a party or so. So they have some form of, we could say, informal land tenure. They don't really own the land, but they're stewards of it. And so as we're thinking, or as the city is thinking about disposing of this land, selling it off, of course, those people should have some sort of say in, or some kind of ability to acquire the land or to keep it. But who that is something that you can't really find out. There's no data map, there's no cadastral of stewards, of land stewards, right? So here, for example, this little piece of the neighborhood you see here, who uses or who stewards which land. Mark owns a property here, has expanded his property, takes care of that. Marty takes care of this. So there's these kind of invisible or informal networks in the neighborhood that are really hard for us as planners from the outside to understand, right? That's a kind of local knowledge that you can't find in a database, and that you have to acquire by talking to people, like in formal meetings, right? In these in informal settings, in specific settings. Again, in the context of the Bengali community, this is a meeting specifically for women, and but also on the street, right? And that's what in order to be able to talk to, people who don't come to any community meetings, here we decided to use the tool of an ice cream truck, which is a very everyday piece of infrastructure in Detroit, and particularly in that neighborhood, right? So you see these ice cream trucks driving around everywhere, and we appropriated one, took one, and turned it into an engagement tool. So this is a ice cream truck plus a map of the neighborhood that allows us to as outsiders, gain knowledge of the neighborhood by talking to people who, again, would never show up at the planning meeting, of course, right? But who are, walking the few steps from their home to buy an ice cream, and then are happy to share their knowledge, especially since they are getting an ice cream for free in exchange, right? So this is just one example of the way in which we're using design or design objects as part of a planning process, right? To acquire knowledge, like in the case of the ice cream truck, in this example, as a way to use carefully designed objects to create, again, temporary public spaces, spaces of conversation, spaces of knowledge transfer that allow more people to participate in processes that they usually wouldn't participate in, right? So this is the ice cream truck. This is a model of the city of Cambridge. We're working on the comprehensive plan for the city of Cambridge, and as part of that, again, our experience is there's a community meeting, and always the same people show up, namely those that have time to go to a meeting, that don't have to pick up their kids from school, that are able actually to set time aside to come to the community meeting. And so through these meetings, we're missing a huge part of the population, namely those that don't have the time, don't even know that processes like that are going on. And therefore, we're designing objects that we can put out there, like this model, right? It's a table of the city of Cambridge with chairs of the neighborhoods, right? And so this thing is traveling around the neighborhood in a van, right? So going to the sidewalks, going to public libraries as really a kind of conversation starter to gather information about people's everyday lives, but also really to have a conversation about things like zoning and planning that are often thought of as, you know, sort of expert knowledge, but they're really in, you know, everybody can talk to that, right? Everybody has an idea of what the city is and what the city should be and how we should shape the tools to get to that state. So that is another part of our participatory work, namely not only to gather information and to start conversations, but also to demystify planning, right? To say, okay, this zoning is not that hard. It's actually a really dumb, simple tool, right? And it's something that can change, that you can take part in changing, so demystifying planning. The medium we use for that in Cambridge is a newspaper, which works pretty well. So you see, it's a free newspaper, one of those things that are in a newspaper box or that you get at the subway in the morning, right, that has information about the plan, that asks for feedback, but that also has, like, say, games like this one, which is a kind of a zoning puzzle, right? So look at this drawing of Harvard Square and tell us what is wrong here and what works with the zoning and what doesn't. City of Detroit, working on the rezoning of the city, and for that we developed this game. It's called the Game of Zones, which is a game that again tries to demystify the way that zoning works. Okay. Another game for the city of Antwerp, and I think I should probably not go into detail with that and just sort of maybe conclude with this last process that we're working on for St. Louis, where we're in the process of designing a park or a series of playscapes, playgrounds, right? So our client is the Parks Department, but our actual client are children who know about playgrounds, of course, and there we've developed, and we're kind of proud of it, a whole process of working together with our future clients. So multiple steps. So the first one is engaging. These are playgrounds that are far removed, actually, from the neighborhoods where kids live who need the most, or the most in need of playgrounds, right? And so we're going out to neighborhoods that are not immediately adjacent, but where we find our future constituency of kids in, you know, dozens of schools, and we work with them to make these collages and models and so on, sort of the typical stuff, right? What would you like to see in a playground? But where maybe it goes a step further is that it doesn't end there, and a lot of community outreach ends there, right? You have a meeting and then you make something nice and that's it, and that's sort of the box checked for community outreach. What we're trying to do, or what we developed here in this process, is then to translate, to really take that input seriously, translate it into design sketches. So what is it that was here proposed by our clients, and how could that translate given, say, our expertise or our skills as designers? How can that translate into an actual object? And then next step, evaluation, right? To actually go back, and we have here what we call a youth advisory council, which is basically kids that come back for another session, and they're evaluating this stuff, right? And giving their, not only their first ideas, but sort of giving a critique of these playgrounds. And then the next step is to prototype, using whatever material is around to prototype some of those things. And then that will be the next step: test, refine, and go. Ready are the playgrounds. Why do we think this is important, or why do we put so much effort in this first part of the project, or this outreach part of the project? One is to do the right thing, right? If you're designing a public space, there should be participation. and it should not be tokenism. It shouldn't just be a kind of a community meeting for its own purpose, but you should take seriously the feedback you get along the way and respond to it. Second, it just makes the design potentially better, right? I mean, design for us in the office is a conversational activity. It always involves multiple voices, and this is just bringing in new voices. And so the question is, you know, if you, instead of coming up with these ideas of how to complexify your design, can that actually happen in conversation with future clients and with a group that is as large as possible. Third point, again, in this case, you can't design a hospital there, but this is really talking to, when we're talking about a public space, our client here, the kids, are probably the best experts of understanding what is useful in terms of the public space, in terms of the playground equipment, and that is it. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. It was awesome. So many great things you do. I'm amazed. I really love the ice cream truck. It's my favorite.
Maybe it's the weather.
Maybe it's the weather, but this is similarity with our project. We have a huge shipping white container. We call it maybe metropolitan container because we use it for participation. We presented our land use plan last year, and this year we used it for redesigning of square on Žižkov.
Okay.
And sometimes we meet people that they disagree with us, what we want to do there, and sometimes they ask us for fried chicken or ice cream, or they want to know the opening hours of the museum. So maybe we should start to sell ice cream or beer. That's equivalent of ice cream in Czech Republic, I think. I want to ask you about the Detroit. I know that Detroit passed some very difficult years in terms of economy. What about the people? What about their, you know, are they open to discussion? Are they open to changes? What's their mentality right now?
Well, I mean, it's so hard to make a general statement about that, right? Because you have many different groups, right? It's even in this planning area that we're working with, there's sort of different groups, different immigrant groups, different times in which people moved there. So there's a African-American community that moved to that particular neighborhood because they were thrown out of a neighborhood closer to downtown that was raised in the 1950s. So it was an early urban renewal project actually to make space for a Mies van der Rohe designed development. So there's a whole community that was pulled out of their home, and then a lot of those people moved to this neighborhood, and so there are long entrenched fears of planning, of course. Then there's a more recent immigrant community, and they're from Bangladesh, and of course with other kind of, say, boundaries there that are going on. So there are different groups that have different attitudes towards planning and change.
What about the NIMBY, not in my backyard effect? Does it work there?
It's a good question. I mean, there is so the time and sort of the two things of Detroit that I showed you, the Blotz project, and then also some of the work in the neighborhood plan. Right now, they're dealing with neighborhoods of Detroit that were really largely vacated, right? Where there was a lot of vacancy and where the value of the land was mainly use value, right? So there was really very little exchange value to land. So and it's an interesting time, right, to see, or an interesting moment to see what do people do with their property when it doesn't have an exchange value, right? It's purely about how do you want to live. That has changed a little bit, and there's some also, you know, speculation coming in and so on. I would say that NIMBY is perhaps not there and perhaps not there yet. I mean, that seems more of an attitude in neighborhoods or in communities in the United States that want to defend what they have, right? So, and we talked about that earlier, that there is certain neighborhoods that feel quite empowered and try to keep what they have, keep the quality of their, and a lot of it isn't actually in the arsenal, right? How do communities, what kind of tools do they develop and invent to preserve their what they think is rightfully theirs, even if it's publicly financed, and how do they protect that from others? Detroit, these communities that we're working with in Detroit are not that, right? So the protection or the defensiveness comes from a different place, I would say. It's more about, fear of planning in one case, or just, general misunderstanding of planning, or fear of gentrification, perhaps, right? So, yeah.
All right, okay. Do you have any questions? Yeah? Great.
Hi. Thank you for the presentation. I have a question. Do you think that, well, I have a set of questions that are connected.
That's the first one.
Do you think that what you do is architecture, and that you are architects and it's job of architects, and whether you have other disciplines in your teams? Mm-hmm. And then that's a bigger question. I'm playing with an idea that, let's say with the climate emergency, the construction industry is actually one of the biggest part of the production of CO2 emissions. Yeah. So, and architects contribute to that, obviously. Mm-hmm. So I thought that if one of the solution, or like the way how to help out would be to stop building and just reprogram the things we have. So if you also have this in mind, or if there is a motivation in terms of like connected to the climate conditions, mm-hmm. and if you would say yes, do you think that that the current students of architecture are somehow prepared to this path, that the architecture education is not now only focused on building, but also to reprogramming or I don't know, participation processes and so on? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes, that's a good question. I mean, yes, I would say this is architecture, right? And we are not, I mean, because architecture is really about expansion, right? I feel like we are, even if in architecture schools we are not prepared in the way that you or I would like to see to deal with larger questions, indirectly we are, right? Because we are trained specialists in nothing specific, right? But in coordinating everything and synthesizing and thinking about, the meaning of this room and the HVAC system and the person who puts in the electrical and so on, right? So that's sort of what we do. And so therefore I always think it's I think it's so sad when people sort of try to defend their niche as architecture and try to define an essence, right? Because I don't think there is, and talk about the building, eternal building of art, art of building, and so on, right? Because I think what we really have going for us as architects is that we're trained to do this, to synthesize in this way with, I mean, we're forced to, I don't know how about you in architecture school here, but we're reading all these texts and at the same time we're drawing a detail, right? And that's great. I mean, there's one of the, if you think about it, there are very few disciplines left who have that ambition without admitting to it, right? To do a little bit of everything. But so yeah, so the admission to activate that potential that is in architecture, I think that is important. To embrace the kind of what seems like an almost outdated global ambition of thinking about built material and about a million rules, right? The law and so many other things, right? That is embedded in our discipline, and therefore I think we should embrace it and activate that to solve, yes, bigger challenges. To deal not only with, oh, this is not there's a kind of a social problem, but that's not really what I'm here to deal with, because I'm just here to build this wall, right? That is, I think that's something I think that's a mistake in the way that architecture is practiced. So they might, but I do agree. I do think that's something we can embrace, and then I think we can, handle larger challenges like that. Yes, the question of CO2. Yes, the question of architecture is not always about just putting up a building, but it's about programming, of course, right? That's something we're dealing with, and we can also reprogram something, and it might be just much more efficient. Or we can use what we design to start a process of people coming together around it, right? So those ways in which we can activate our skills, I think, are important, and it can, of course, deal with larger challenges. Did I miss one of them?
And do you have other disciplines in your team?
We are
like in Interboro has other anthropologists, sociologists, or people like that?
No, we don't. I mean, we really, because we're approaching these. I mean, of course, you can say we're working as anthropologists, and should we be doing that, or as ethnographers, right? But we have sort of, I mean, that's, I guess, the confidence of architecture. We can do that, right? This is sort of something we don't need to kind of, we can, if we want to understand if we want to design for the people, for the way that people live, we of course need to study and understand how people live, right? And how that happens. And that's what an anthropologist does. And I think we need to do it. So, I mean, of course, we collaborate. I mean, we have a lot of anthropologists friends. We have a lot of authors in the Arsenal and so on, right? And we, but no, in the team, because the team is structured really like a conventional architecture office. So, of course, there are academic collaborations, but we're working really in this way as architects.
Okay, you graduated at Harvard, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, is that school ready for modern type of architecture, climate change and everything?
Yeah.
Are there any modern programs for architects? Something that's reprogrammed architecture?
I think that's just what is in the DNA of that school is an interdisciplinarity, right? And it's not always activated to the fullest or to the degree that it could be, but that's built into it, and that's what I try to say. There's something precious about the sort of old-fashioned attitude of architecture as sort of making connections with everything, right? Having a little bit fingers in everything, and that's something again that I think we should embrace as architects, and that the school could do a bit of a better job at, but at least it's really one big space that contains architecture and planning, two disciplines that, at least in the United States, are often extremely separated, right? There's the complete focus on design on one side, the design object, and then almost dismissive attitude towards anything built on the planning side, and that's it's not good, it's harmful, and the GSD has at least the infrastructure to handle that.
All right, we had another question.
I have a question, but it's more general. Because I'm not aware of the situation. How are perceived in general these participatory practices in USA? Are you some like one diamond in the UC, or is it becoming a common thing in the architect offices, or also from side of municipalities, how they perceive your work?
I think we're sort of a little bit out there. So there's some of it going on, but again, as I tried to say, there's certain conventional processes, and projects have these required community planning projects, of course, right? Have required community meetings and so on, but it's often just so boring, right? And so it's really kind of tokenism, I think, right? So. And that's again where I think we as office, but also more broadly as architects, can contribute with the sort of design sensibility, right? An event, you can design that, and you can think about what are the right tools, what are the right spaces, what is the right process, and might be more effective then. So yes, there is some participation, but a lot of it, I would say, is not that good. And so, but I think it's probably more people are municipalities also growing more interested in it and so on. So yeah, I mean, people are aware, of course, that the old way of planning, as a bunch of guys drawing lines on a map, are over, and you cannot be maintained, and are looking for other ways of doing this. So.
Another question?
Yeah, I just have a small detailed question to the previous one. As you're working also on park design and urban design scale, do you have landscape architects in your team in Interboro, or do you also work with them externally?
No,
As with the sociologists?
Actually we work with we have a landscape architect. Yes. Yeah.
So it's not just because in Czech we perceive like architects as just the like building architects. So I felt it's important to hear that it's it's landscape architects too.
Yes, of course, and it's sort of very blurry there, and we're again sort of sometimes have a hard time with this sort of saying where exactly the boundary is between, especially with the sort of work we're doing, right? Where does the architecture end and something else begin? Where is actually the border between urban design and landscape? Right? It's really hard to. There's a few ingredients, right, that come from these different background training, but. I mean, it's like the city out there, right? Where did you really sort of, where do you say, where does the sidewalk end and the park begin, right? Those are really very theoretical boundaries, and I feel the same about the disciplines that are dealing with them.
Yeah, exactly. And also with the furniture you design, for example, you also include the greenery into it, and architects, the traditional architects, we don't know nothing about it nearly. So that's important. Thank you.
Well, the question about landscape, I saw a video about the holding pattern, Museum of Modern Art, and I heard something about million trees, program of million trees in New York. Planting that happened, really?
Well, the Million Trees campaign, yes, that was sort of both a public and a private initiative a couple of years ago. Yeah, I think they're pretty.
So it was about planting million trees in New York, whole New York.
In New York, right.
Because we have a similar program in Prague right now. City Hall want to plant 1 million trees in 4 years in Prague. So I'm just wondering how it's possible.
I don't know where they're at now, but there is, I mean, on the public side, the city is, you can, if you have a site where you want a tree.
So it was like trees, I mean, tree in the sidewalk or in the bins and everything.
Yeah, if you have a spot where you want a tree, then you can
every
ask
tree
for
counts.
it, and then it tests if the tree will survive, and then the tree will go there. That's
okay. But holding pattern is one of my favorite project. It was really nice, really beautiful. I saw another question there. Yeah.
I had a question. Do you work for the municipality? So do they hire you as an external agency and you just have the task and you realize that, or you co-create with them?
That sort of depends on the project. I mean, with these planning projects, yes, they're often RFP processes, right, where cities have a competition on RFP for planning work. And then, so in the Detroit case, for example, yes, we're working for the city, but as a separate agency, or a separate office that then is able to work a little bit outside of the existing structures. And so the big, one idea of this way of organizing, well, for one, Detroit doesn't have the capacity to handle these neighborhood plans, but it's also a way for a kind of outside office to work across these silos of different agencies, right? So there's tons of different agencies that are responsible for planning, and as an outside consultant, one can, in the best case, be a moderator between them and connect between them. But yeah, so it's a collaborative work between cities. But a lot of the planning work in these American cities now is done not in-house in planning offices, but through offices like ours, in Cambridge and in Detroit and Newark. Yeah.
Sorry, just wait for a mic because of people on Facebook.
Do you have like an estimation on, like, for example, for New York, like how many agencies are realizing like this kind of project? How many agencies are involved?
Agencies meaning
like
offices, architecture offices, or within the
architecture,
cities?
planning, design.
Well, we're a little bit an unusual office, and that we're a relatively, small office that's doing these planning and urban design, you have more of a specialization, also talking again to the kind of ambition of embracing different scales, right? The ambition to be able to work at the scale of planning and of a piece of furniture that sits on the street, right? So that is something that I think is great about architecture, and that we learn in school. That's why we become architects, right? We want to have our fingers in all these different scales and design at all these different scales. But of course, it's also not the most efficient, and so you have more specialization, right? You have very large planning offices and architecture offices and landscape offices. So it's a little bit out of an unusual situation. So there are a lot of very large firms. There are smaller firms, but most of them are more focusing on small architecture. So in that sense, I don't think there are a lot. Most of them actually, most of our competitors, I would say, are landscape architecture firms who are trying to get into the urban design realm. Is that the questions, or what the range of professional offices in New York for who does this sort of work?
Yeah, kind of. I was more asking about like whether there's like one main planning office, like for example.
Oh,
like
on
in
the city
Prague.
side, the
Yes.
planning office. Oh, okay.
And like how much, like what is the percentage of work that like the planning is done by the main office and like by external offices?
Oh, the percentage of the work that planning. It depends on the municipality. So yes, so Detroit, a lot of external work. New York is doing a little bit more internal. And right now, actually, we're doing a plan for the city. We're working with the city, but in that case, it's the Department of Health, which is interesting, right? That the Department of Health is doing placemaking and planning in the Bronx. So there, even within the city administration, there's, I wouldn't say competitors because they work together, but different agencies that have their hands in planning. But I don't know what the percentage would be in New York. It's typically for smaller projects that they farm out, but there's a lot more capacity in the planning office in the city. Plus in other agencies like the Economic Development Corporation, that is a quasi-public agency that's doing work. Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome. Another question? Someone? Yeah. Second row.
So another a bit detailed question. What happened, because here in Czech Republic we are used to it when we own a plot, it's privately owned, we in like 90% fence that, and everybody knows that's privately owned and you didn't go there. The plans you showed in Detroit, there was a lot of like the vacant plots, which I haven't seen any fences around, unless some of the people buy them and add them to their house and plot and create. What happens in these vacant plots, even though they are private, but they are publicly accessible? Is there any, do people, the residents inhibit it somehow and then they are pushed back and etc. What's the life of that spots?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the vacant land in this area that I showed you is actually city-owned, right? So people leave, or at the time when the land value was really low, left the city, and then stopped paying their taxes, and therefore the land reverted to the city. So the city has this huge number of parcels that they own that are vacant, and trying to figure out what to do with it, right? Because of the maintenance question, of course. So a lot of that vacant land you just see is actually city-owned. There's some that then are picked up, as I showed you in the beginning, picked up by neighbors, right, who want to have more property and maybe don't have the means yet to do anything with it, right? So that's also a question. You buy the land is still very cheap, but you buy it and then you save up and then you try to improve it. But most of the vacant land is actually city-owned currently, and so in a way it's sort of a burden on the city. It's also what we try to propose. It's also an opportunity, right? Because when is the city in a position that they have owned so much land and can actually do something like put a new street through here without having, to expropriate millions of people and having a huge conflict around there, right? So there's this opportunity, but primarily it's a burden, and therefore we help them develop different strategies of, well, privatizing it or turning it into, or privatizing in the sense of giving it to the groups there or neighbors, or doing other stuff with that vacant land.
Mental ownership.
What's that?
Mental ownership of the...
Yes, yes. Right.
Well, we have another question.
Yeah. I'm struck that what you're doing sounds radically, it sounds like radically democratic in ways that I'm not sure that everyone would accept in some ways. I'm just curious, these municipalities, are you dealing with highly enlightened organizations that understand what it is you do? Or is part of your, or do you sort of get your foot in the door and then convince them to look at public spaces in a completely different way? I mean, I was struck by this example of the museum, where you used all these different parts that were then spread all around the city, creating connections in multiple different ways. Do they have any idea what you're doing ahead of time, or are they really surprised about what comes out of what it is you end up doing? Thanks.
Good question. Well, I would say both, right? So they were, I mean, of course, this is, in this case, this is the Museum of Modern Art's an institution that thinks of it as itself as enlightened in a certain way and gives a certain leeway, say, to their artists or their architects in this case. I have to say this was a competition where we presented to the board in the beginning, and I do have to say that we didn't really emphasize that part of the project, but another one, right, which was much more about the build form, partially because we thought this might be raise too many questions, but more importantly also because we hadn't really asked any of the neighbors, because we didn't, in case we didn't get the project, we didn't want to make false promises. So it was a kind of a gamble, right, both with the client and with the if the project would actually work out this way. But yeah, it was, in a way, it was a little bit, and then maybe we're taking some tactics from the opposite side in the Arsenal, right, to do something under the radar and sneak something in. So, but in this case, it really was about taking a budget or budget stream that is for sculptural piece of architecture and turning it into an urban design project, right? And that is not how we presented it to the client in the beginning.
Okay, we have another question here.
I have one more question.
Wow, this is great.
I'm always thinking by all these participatory offices, and I'm also doing similar work somehow, about that. How it's presented is always about somehow straightforward decisions towards something. Of course, I'm sure it's not so easy and decision process is very difficult, but what I'm interested in right now, and the question is, what is then your role as an architect in the end regarding aesthetics? Like what role does aesthetic approach plays in it? Because of course, not all the things which then end up to be an object or something are decided in the process. So what are your references and how do you think about the aesthetics of these objects or architecture you do?
Well, maybe two ways to answer that question, right? One is, careful design, right, which is something, again, that I feel is important and often in these processes doesn't happen, right? It's always, somebody putting up a post-it on the wall or so. So it's not really carefully designed, right? And so that, to put care into that and really say, this is not something we do here and then the serious stuff happens there, but this is really, we really designed this and we really thought about this, and these objects, they are important, right? I think that is part of the idea, and that would gives it some sort of weight, I think. So in that sense, aesthetic plays a role as part of that. And then beyond that, maybe thinking more towards the results of these processes, it's sort of an interesting challenge, since some of the, say, design processes are not entirely controlled by the designer, or ideally they aren't, right? But there are different discourses that are challenging each other, and that's good, right? That's what the public space is about. Of course, we don't want to deny our own role as people who have a very strong sense of what looks good and what doesn't, and what things should look like, and have certain design preferences, right? And that's okay, but it's one voice among others that are, challenged. And I would think that perhaps the results, if not better, become more complex and contradictory if those different discourses are challenged.
Well, thanks.
Right.
My question is, you had the chance to see Prague yesterday.
Yes.
What was your first impression in terms of public space? Where we should start? Do you have some simple idea?
Well, we actually took a little tour before, which was great, just around here. I mean, what I saw was really nice, right? And great. I mean, what I hear though is, and understand, that Prague in some ways is in similar situation as New York City is, right? In that there's incredible pressure on housing, right? And housing affordability, and apartments turned into temporary apartments and so on. So those are challenges that we're also facing in New York City, and that is sort of a reminder of the fact that yes, we can think about the public space, this design of public space, and there's certain things that work better than others, and certain things that are kind of creating barriers. But we can't think of that as separated from the housing issue, right? And that's something that is, again, sort of really important in the arsenal, right? To look at public space and the question of the private space, right? And if you have a great public space out there and nobody is hanging out in it because, or only really rich people are hanging out in it because nobody else can live around there, that is something that happened in New York City, right? In a lot of spaces were a great program for, plazas during the Bloomberg years, but at the same time, the people who are inhabiting these plazas become more and more homogenous because nobody else is living in walking distance to those places, right? So those two questions, I think, of public space and the affordability question are related in places like New York City, and I think very much in Prague as well. Right?
I wanted to ask you if there is a NIMBY in Manhattan when you don't have a backyards, but I won't ask that. I will just say thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. And also thanks to Georgine Theodore, your partner of in Interboro, for visiting us. It was really amazing. Thank you for your presentation. Please applause.
Thank you.
Tobias.
And thank you for those great questions, everybody. Thanks.
Tak, já vám tímto děkuji, loučím se s vámi společně s posledními Urban Talks téhle sezóny. Doufám, že se sem zase v srpnu a v září postupně vrátíte a budete tady rádi trávit čas. Děkuji za skvělé otázky, byli jste báječní, případně můžete večer doporučit známým, bude na YouTube. Děkuji moc krát, mějte se krásně.